The hole in the world didn't crash closed, didn't flash closed. Slowly, inexorably, it fell in on itself until the view of the dimly lit mobile home park on the other side of the tracks was clear in the night. The flashing lights and thrumming ground were still. Andy didn't remember falling on his butt, but it was firmly planted on the sand. His palms were flat against it and his elbows hurt from the impact. He stared at the mobile homes, only dimly comprehending, or trying to comprehend, what he had just saw. Tom was gone. So was the hole. He ripped his eyes from what was no longer there and tried to focus on John's silhouette against the light on the other side of the tracks. John was just standing there, arms hanging at his sides, shaking his head slowly. Finally Andy coughed. "He's gone." John found his voice. "He can't be. There's nowhere for him to go." Andy thought about getting to his feet but decided against it. He didn't trust his legs. "No hole, no stick, no Tom. Got an explanation for that?" The air felt thick as they tried to catch their breath in the dark. He looked at John. "We should look for him." "Look where?" He moved up the hill and extended his hand. Andy grabbed his arm at the wrist and let him pull him to his feet. They stood there wet and cold, both dimly aware that they could never go back to the way things were only hours before. "Maybe we should call the cops," he breathed. He had to say something. Andy shook his head. "And tell them what? That our friend jumped through a hole in space-time and the vacuum of trailer parkness, never to be seen again?" John couldn't take his eyes from where he had seen the unbelievable only moments before. "Do you have a better explanation for what happened?" Andy was staring down the hill with his mouth slightly open. "Come on, you're the one with the fast answers." "Maybe." He straightened his shoulders and sighed. "But he had the right answers. Most of the time, anyway." John forced himself to turn and start back up the hill. "Come on. Let's go back to the campsite and restart the fire. Put on some dry clothes and think about this. As far as I can tell, there's not a damn thing we can do for him here." Andy didn't like the thought of walking away, but he couldn't come up with a better plan. Or any plan. The only thing he was sure of was that they were going to find Tom one way or the other, no matter where he went. The walk back to the campsite felt like it took forever, although it was only a quarter-mile. Andy could hear John crash between the trees. The sounds of thorns sticking in his jeans confirmed he wasn't dreaming. His wet clothes were cold, and he felt water ooze between his toes and his soaked boots. The fire was still lit. John stared at the flames through the last of the trees in front of them. He was sure they put it out before they went to sleep, but couldn't deny it was lit now. Orange-yellow flames snapped the air. Sparks rose toward the wet trees above. "I thought we put that out." "We did." He could almost see Andy's face in the light from the fire. "Then why is it still going?" Andy stared straight ahead, transfixed. "Because that guy lit it again." "What guy?" "Me." John stiffened at the sound of the voice. He stared at the man sitting next to the fire with his back against the fallen tree a few feet from where Tom sat earlier. Flickering firelight shadows danced over the man's face. His eyes were bright in the dim light. His beard, long and wild, flowed over tattered robes on his chest. The man's left arm was bent at an odd angle, his wrist limp over his long thighs. A rag, maybe a portion of his robe, was tied around his arm just below the left shoulder. Blood seeped through the rag and ran down his forearm, dripping in the shadows on the muddy ground. The fire snapped. John jumped. The man coughed, almost a dry chuckle, and blood spilled over his matted beard. He wheezed and looked down at his chest. John could see clotted blood at the top of his thin hair and couldn't decide if the hair was bloody black or bloody gray. Andy wanted to shriek and run for the car, but something kept him locked in place. He whispered, "This is too weird for one night." The man pointed at them. His hand shook in the shadows. "Are you going to stand there and look at me like a couple of imbeciles, or are you going to give aid to a wounded man?" There was a sword at the man's side. Blood covered the blade and hilt. Chunks of what might have been flesh made Andy's stomach start to roll and the urge to run almost irresistible. How he could see the look on Andy's face he didn't know, but he was sure he could. "Do not fear my sword, youngster. I'm not going to kill you." The old man spat blood into the fire. "As it happens, we need each other, if only briefly." Andy looked sideways at John, swallowed a hunk of fear, and smiled. "Are you sure you don't want to go back to my place for some late-night porn?" John moved toward the fire and the wounded man. "What can we do to help?" His eyes were dark over the fire, and the twist of his eyebrows deepened the shadows of his eye sockets. "Where's the third?" "Beg your pardon?" Andy said. "The third man, your friend. Where is he?" John answered. "He went through the hole." His heart raced in his chest during the brief silence that quickly grew uncomfortable. "Is there something we can do to help you?" "Do not worry over me. The old man smiled through bloody lips. "You should worry more about your friend. Time is short. Not for me, but for you." Andy moved closer. He wished he had a gun. His BB gun would be more than what he had. "Who the hell are you?" "I told you not to worry about that." The old man gave him a hawkish look with one eye. "Your friend went through Mythilus. I felt him pass." "What's Mythilus?" John knelt by the man's side and reached for his wounded arm. The old man twitched it away before he could touch it. "Mythilus was my means of escape. I should never have opened it." He shook his head. Blood splashed from his mouth to his shoulder with a violent cough. "It is a gateway between worlds, specifically your world and mine. I came through— Get away from my arm!" He snapped his good arm at John. Red light danced in his palm. Andy saw the ball of light hit John's chest, knocking him backward over the log he brought to the fire. "You son of a—" was all he got out. The man in the robe turned his palm toward him. He froze with the rest of the phrase still in his mouth. "You have no time to waste." The man struggled to his feet and swayed in the firelight. Somehow he gave the impression he was staring at both Andy and John with the same glance, but it wasn't possible from that angle. He wondered if he could shove the guy to the ground and beat the crap out of him. He was sure John would help, but would it be enough? "If you do not wish your friend to die alone in a strange world, you will stand before me and hear what I have to say." He took a deep old man's breath. It made a wet noise as it slid over his beard and bloody lips. "Well, what will it be?" John was the first to move. He stood up very slowly and looked at Andy over the fire, their eyes locking for half a second. His step was deliberate as he moved next to Andy in front of their tent and looked at the wounded man. The wizard's voice was low, almost a mumble lost in the snapping of the wood of the wet fire. "Almost old enough, but with no discernible skills. What a mess I have made. No matter, the choice is theirs." Andy shook his head at the guy's muttering. He could hear the words but didn't understand. It was gibberish, but was he talking to himself? Wasn't he? Is he crazy? That thought brought out a laugh. "I'm standing here in the woods wondering if my apparition is crazy." The wizard spat blood again. It sizzled in the fire in the silence that fell as he stared at them. John shot Andy a look and was surprised to see Andy looking back at him. He nodded slightly and thought, "Are you ready?" It seemed like a long time before Andy's eyes hardened and he returned the nod. The wizard coughed, still looking at both of them with the same glance. "Jedruli Sinkofi." He shook his head. "Come with me." He bent down and grabbed his staff. Blood ran down his forearm and laced through his fingers in the firelight. He pressed the other hand against the small of his back and straightened, then moved 3 steps into the woods toward the hill. "Come!" he snarled over his shoulder. "I told you there is no time to waste." Andy whispered, "Do you have any idea what the hell we got ourselves into this time?"